it's not very often that we actually bring an agent up here to talk to you guys, but fortunately, we don't act in the undercover capacity very often, so most of the community know who we are anyway. I've been a cop for about 12 years. For the past several years, I've been on the what we know as the Madison-Morgan County HIDTA Drug Task Force. HIDTA stands for High Intensity Drug Traffic Area. That alone should tell you a lot. If we have a federally funded task force that's in the North Alabama area, obviously there's a drug problem here. I'm just going to really talk about the evolution of the opioid epidemic and the crisis that's going on in the nation, how it kind of evolved here locally. A lot of the things have already been said. You've heard it on the news. Nothing's really changed, you know, with it. So I may say some things that's already been said. I may say some things that's not been said. I will say that I'm going to talk fast because I'm going to try to cover as much as I can in a short amount of time. In the early 2000s, late 90s and the early 2000s, it really started with hydrocodone and Percocet here, which is an opiate. That's where the abuse really started. Working into the early 2000s is when we saw an influx in abuse in like oxycodone, oxycontin, the hardcore prescription opioids. The sales started going out on the streets. People started realizing that they could make money selling their prescriptions, and they started doing that. It wasn't just the people with legitimate prescriptions that realized this, it was the drug dealers as well. The average price back then was about $1 a milligram, so the typical 30 milligram oxycodone tablet would cost you $30 on the streets. Of course, as I said, they realized the money that they could bring in off those, and unfortunately, drug dealers took full advantage of that. People began selling their prescription drugs. They would go on the streets and they would sell a whole prescription of oxycodone for $500. They would meet people outside of the pharmacy and just right there, as soon as they get the prescription, they sell it. That still goes on today. Back in the early 2000s, it was going on a lot more. They would sell that prescription for $500, and a drug dealer would turn around and turn that $500 into $2,500, $4 grand. Because if you do the math, 90 pills, 120, $30 a pop, that's a lot of money. So they more than doubled their profits. A lot of people ask, well, why wouldn't a person just sell their own prescription? A lot of the reasons, there's a few reasons that we know of is, number one, lack of resources. Typically people that were on pain medications back then, they weren't really, you know, the majority of them weren't drug dealers, and they were on these prescriptions whether it was necessary or not. So they didn't really have the network to go out and sell their pills. They didn't know people on the streets. They just kept to themselves, and they might have shared them with family members or something like that. Financial distress. A lot of people that's on pain management and that's on pain medication, they're disabled. They aren't drawing a lot of money. So the thought of quick cash and selling their prescription that they may not need, or they can compensate with Advil or ibuprofen and Tylenol and whatnot, that they would just get rid of it and get that quick cash to put food on the table. To obtain other narcotics. A lot of people that were on pain medication, they may have not needed the pain medication. They used it to supplement the income to get the other narcotics that they really want, like methamphetamine or whatever they may be on. Some doctors around the nation also recognize this. Unfortunately, you know, we consider doctors professional. There's a lot of crooked doctors in the nation around the world. And they realize the money that they can make in them, the relationship they have with pharmaceutical companies and everything else. So they began opening up pain management clinics, who what was later named as pill mills. And working into 2005, 6, 7, that was on the rise. They realized how much money that they could make just issuing these prescriptions. I'm sure everybody remembers Dr. Agarwal in Madison, who had a VIP program. Hey, you pay me $1,000 a month, I'll give you whatever you want. Drug dealers began making fictitious medical reports. They would go to these pill mills and they would give the doctor a fake MRI report. The doctor wouldn't verify the MRI report. As long as they had that piece of paper, that's all they wanted. what do you want? Oxycodone, bam, got it. And this is happening locally. This is what we've seen here in Huntsville over the past 18 years. The drug dealers even began paying people. They would go to the homeless shelters and go on the streets. They would pay people, get a 15-passenger rental van, load up 15 people, and they would go from city to city to city, pay these people to go and get prescriptions. They would get as many prescriptions as they could, and then they would bring them back to Huntsville. Once they came back to Huntsville, they would pay their guys, they would leave, and they had thousands of opiates to sell on the streets. Once the drug dealers sold their monthly prescriptions they obtained, they depend on people with legitimate prescriptions and talk them into selling their prescriptions and barter with them and just give them whatever they want to replenish their supply. When it comes to prescription crimes like that are going on, whether it be somebody obtaining drugs by fraud, a doctor that's issuing phony prescriptions, somebody that's printing prescriptions, we have a specific agent in our unit that works those crimes. We call them diversion crimes. He does an excellent job. He has good relationships with the doctors and the pharmacists and just people that deal with it around the area, who also tip him off on anything that may be suspicious or whether it be an individual or a doctor. Thanks to the crackdown, the federal government really cracked down on doctors issuing prescriptions. They kind of touched on that. And a large portion of the pill mills were shut down because of guidelines that the doctors had to follow, systems that followed the prescriptions. It made it harder to get the prescriptions, which affected the people that had been taking them who were addicted to them, and also the people who were selling to them. People that were once getting unnecessary prescriptions and who were addicted to the medications, they had to look to the streets to get their fix because they were unable to get those prescriptions that were so easy to get at that point in time. Drug dealers had to work harder to find people that were willing to sell their prescriptions, find people that would, with places that they could go, people they could pay to get them, just to, obtain the drugs. Prices began to skyrocket for Roxy's, any oxycodone-based tablets around here, 2008, 9, 10 time frame, going from like $30 a pill to like $45. And in some cities, it was up to like $65 for one 30-milligram oxycodone tablet. This caused property crimes to skyrocket. People were stealing from families and friends. You had people, more and more solicitation, prostitution, in order to obtain the drugs. And it really got bad there for a while, and it still is. As more attention got brought to the abuse of prescription opiates, pharmaceutical companies began to try to change things and try to curb it as it was brought up. I think Karen said about the pharmaceutical companies reformulating pills to try to make them sticky and gooey. They couldn't be injected. It didn't work. And in order to inject a tablet, you have to take the tablet, you crush it up, and you dissolve it in a solution, or typically just water, and then it's heated, and then it's drawn up, filtered into an insulin-like syringe. They begin making these pills to try to prevent that from happening. Well, you can't crush it up, it chunks up, it won't dissolve, this and that. People were figuring out how to do it. It failed, and it just didn't work. Around 2010 was about the time that the local introduction of designer drugs came. Of course, heroin and fentanyl and MDMA and all that, it's been around for a long time. I mean, MDMA, Studio 54 days, people were taking liquid MDMA. Meth's been around forever. Heroin's been around forever. It just went down, but it came back around 2010, and that's really when we started seeing the arrests. Our unit started making multiple possession arrests, trafficking arrests, and heroin. around 2011, HPD, I believe they started making their heroin arrests on the streets. That started picking up in 2011. When I say picking up, I'm talking about like one every few months to multiple a month in that time frame. And now you got sometimes multiple a day. The pill pricings went up, and addicts and dealers they began to look for an alternative, and heroin was their answer at that point. Heroin was generally cheaper, just depending city to city, than getting pills on the streets. The North Alabama area was on the high end price-wise when it came to purchasing heroin. Unfortunately, we've seen a rapid decrease in the price of heroin on the streets. Something that once was obtained for $300 a gram, you're getting it for $125 a gram here. Sometimes down to $90, and $90 is what we refer to as like Chicago and Ohio prices. And up there, it's decreasing to like $50 a gram. Drug dealers began to push it instead of pills, and really put it on people. Heroin's commonly injected, but it can also be snorted and smoked. At that time, there weren't as many IV users, and if there were IV users, it was cocaine, and some people, shot up meth, but there just weren't a lot of IV users. There weren't as many as today, for sure. And also heroin then, if you think about it, it was real intimidating. People were, heroin's a big time drug, that's a big city drug. They didn't want to do it, and they were scared. Drug dealers saw that fear, and they said, don't worry, I got you. In 2014, our units arrested a subject here in Huntsville that was in possession of several hundred heroin pressed pills. The heroin pressed pills were made to look like Oxycontin. Basically, a pill press was obtained from overseas, and they would use heroin and other binders, and they would put it in the pill press, and they would make the pills. Unfortunately, some people would say fortunately, depending on what you do for a living, but unfortunately, is what I say, the case was shared nationally. The reason why it was shared nationally with other agencies is because that case was one of the very first in the United States, and that was here in Huntsville. These fake pills were distributed for a cheaper price than your regular oxycodone, which users took advantage of that, of course, but they didn't realize that they were doing straight heroin. People became more brave, and heroin became more popular, and drug dealers began to notice how addictive this heroin and opiates in general were getting, and they became more aggressive with their advertising. Locally here, we know for a fact this happened. You had dealers that would start recruiting family members that were in high school, and they would send high school students to school and say, hey, get your friends, try these. They would start taking them to parties, and they would get the younger crowd. Now, I've seen 18-year-olds on heroin. I've arrested 18-year-olds on heroin. I've seen a 15-year-old girl arrested for soliciting. And that's here locally in Huntsville. Major drug organizations also saw this trend. They saw that the pickup in the addiction, so they started pumping more and more to the United States, whether it comes from Afghanistan, Asia, Europe, wherever it's come from. They saw it and they knew it. Mexico. So they started pumping more and more of your synthetics, fentanyl, heroin, everything into the United States.